feeding on my tension. My countrymen, they love their fiction. Words upon now, it's made with good intentions.
Welcome to 1 of 200, the Media and Politics podcast. We're recording this midweek, and we're releasing it on the weekend. I just want to be really clear about that right at the outset for our audience. Things change quickly, and there might be more things happening in the space between recording and release. I'm joined by my co-host, Stephanie Rogers. How are you doing?
Kia ora. It's midweek, so that means things can only get better over the next couple of days. And if anything doesn't get better over the next couple of days, Mitch, please edit out that I said this.
Mitch, leave it in, because that will be... we're also joined by a very special guest, Dr. Cassandra Mudgway. How are you?
Kia ora koutou te whānau. I am doing well. Thank you for having me.
Now, we're hoping to have a wider discussion around online abuse and violent rhetoric. I guess probably the best way to start for our audience, and maybe for people who don't know you, Cassandra, what do you do? What is your academic area, and what have you been looking at in the last couple of years?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Cassandra Mudgway. I am a senior law lecturer at the University of Canterbury. And the last few years, my academic interest or research interest has been in online abuse, online violence specifically, gender-based violence, and I look mostly at adult experiences and international human rights law. So that's the lens in which I look at these issues. And I'm particularly interested in public figures like politicians. I'm writing a piece right now about MPs in New Zealand. And not necessarily just like their experience. I'm a law academic, so I'm interested in the regulatory framework that exists in order to address some of the issues that are coming out in that area, and the human rights obligations on the government to address it as well. I think that sums that up.
Yeah, I think that would be a good primer for anyone who is concerned about any appeal to authority I make when referring something back to you. There's been, I think, and anyone following politics, and even perhaps a lot of people who aren't as hooked into it as I am, an uptick in what we'd broadly class as political violence and violent rhetoric in New Zealand specifically. I'd say even over the last 6 months, and then probably going back a couple of years. And I am going to hang it here on the election of this government. So since 2023, we've seen a rapid destabilization of the social structures, social fabric, the economic situation, all these things that make abusive, violent, even just blame rhetoric become more prevalent in the society. I think, would I be correct in saying that is a pretty well trodden area or idea of how this stuff works, Cassandra?
So I think pulling back a little bit and looking internationally, I think there's a lot of interesting trends going on that New Zealand fits into, particularly in Western democracies. So you're looking at one of the trends being a general uptick in online violence, which is really all I can really speak to. And particularly since 2020, and that's self-reported mostly from MPs and local candidates or local politicians. And so particularly around COVID, which was a particular hot button issue that got people talking online in a way that was more violent than perhaps before. And since then, we're seeing that general uptick. So it corresponds with the new government, and there might be more social tensions happening here that are quite different internationally, but I'm seeing it internationally as well.
Right. And I guess we had the dual kind of issues with some of the economic stuff happening since 2020, alongside the lockdowns, alongside, I guess, almost global campaigns around anti-masking, anti-vaccine, and anti-politician stuff, which resulted in, I guess, what we'd call, and maybe there's some contention around the term, but real world examples, physical on the ground examples, things like, do you say protesters erecting mock gallows and things along those lines. Yeah, I'm glad you actually drew it back to 2020, because from a political perspective, one of the first people targeted was Jacinda Ardern. And that's a very well I think, recorded and researched example of that uptick at this point. Arguably left politics due to that significant increase online violence directed towards her.
Absolutely. And not just online violence, but something that threatened her offline safety and the safety of her family and her staff. And that's something that we also see in the research, that if you're a woman leader, it's more likely your family are going to be also targeted, particularly if you have children. So there is that. And what's also happening there that perhaps had been happening, but not to the same extreme before, was a concept of disinformation, medical disinformation, being, I wouldn't say weaponized online because it's not the same as misogyny, but certainly circulated online in a way that it hadn't before. And so if you have that disinformation, and then you also have the general misogyny
Hmm.
directed towards Jacinda Ardern, who, as we know, not only is she a woman leader, but she also exhibits and leans into those more feminine traits that we associate with women, that we usually associate with a bad leader, in terms of like being more weak, right? So
Hmm.
kindness and being more approachable, and doing her Facebook lives and talking about saving people, and that is really confronting if you were used to a certain kind of leader before, even from women. So it's quite different. So I think in combination, these things have revealed, I guess, more online violence and a perpetuation of an escalation actually of those kinds of abuse and threats to something that can actually threaten her life.
And I guess if you can answer this, what do you think happened that allowed that to continue escalating? Because the warning signs really seemed to be there. And this is why I was kind of pinning my point to 2023, where a lot of the amplification of that is coming right from the top of the political pile, right? So from David Seymour, from Winston Peters, from other MPs in government, although to a lesser degree, and then further amplified by the media. But those warning signs were there while Labour was still in government, while Jacinda Ardern was the leader, but they almost feel like they were treated as more fringe at the time. Thus, potentially, not so much that something that the government or kind of the legal industry needed to deal with directly.
What are you asking me though?
Why do you think there wasn't like a more extensive response to it at the time, where we go, oh, wait, okay, stuff is moving in a pretty bad direction here.
Yeah.
We're talking about some of the like protest laws and online abuse stuff now on the back of some of the stuff, particularly some actions that have targeted members of the government. But we weren't really talking about it to the same extent back in the earlier 2020s.
Yeah, so I think we go back to the status quo, which we still have now, which is, total unregulation of online spaces. And we're 20 years into that, by the way, which is why we're in a space where, oh, now we need to do something. What do we do? And I expect that it's because from 2020, there is that escalation of online violence occurring. And I would say that we were talking about it in
Okay.
2020. It was coming up over and over again. You see it in, there's two studies out of Otago that look specifically at MPs during that time period, and the online violence, online abuse, harassment they were experiencing at the time. And then later they did a more in-depth study interview with 11 MPs about that time. And they were talking about it. They were saying that this is getting worse, our safety is at risk, what do we do? And so I don't think it's something that suddenly has happened, but I do think we're the royal we're more open to talking about ways to address online violence now, and like pathetic ways, to be honest, through a few members' bills, right? And what I'm referring to there is that we've got a members' bill from a national MP wanting to ban under 16s from using social media or some social media platforms. We've also got one from Ruben Davidson, Labour MP, which is about regulating online or social media platforms. So they're sitting there, but they're not out of the biscuit tin, so whatever. But we're starting to have those conversations a lot more seriously. And I think that's actually happened because the UK Online Safety Act came into effect in 2023. And Australia is now looking at more serious regulation of online spaces as well. And I think because of that, we've got more conversations at the high level. And people are looking to New Zealand and saying, well, what are you going to do?
Do you think then it's a case of, there was discussion. I remember us having discussions about it on the podcast as well, right? But the machinery is just a little bit behind the ball on it.
What machinery?
The machinery of government, like all the institutions in terms of being able to implement something.
I think it's more political will.
Okay.
Because the previous government had done some work on it. The Ministry of Internal Affairs had a safer online platforms review, and part of that review was a proposal to regulate social media platforms and other services. To put duties on them to, have minimum safety standards to make sure you don't accidentally have somebody making a sexualized deepfake, for example, on your social media platforms, and to stem hate speech, for example. So that work was already being done, and that was from 2021 to 2023. So the bulk of the work had been done, and of course that was thrown out. That was one of the first things that was thrown out by. I always call her Vanderbroek. That's not her name.
Brooke Van Delden.
Van Velden, yes, thank you. And so she threw that out, as citing a bunch of submissions that had come through from the Free Speech Union, saying that this would be a threat to free speech. And so she sided with them and said that's right, it would. And it was part of all the hate speech. This was her argument, as part of all the previous hate speech stuff, and we want nothing to do with that, so we're getting rid of all of that. So there was some movement there. And right now it is political will. The current government are not in a political sort of situation that they want to talk about regulation at all. We do have that weird national bill sitting there that's obviously not being picked up by coalition partners. I would suspect act very much against any kind of ban.
This is the ban against protest outside politicians' homes, right?
No, sorry.
No, another one.
No, this was the ban under 16s.
Oh, right.
Social media. I'm sorry, I'm just talking about social media regulation.
Don't start me on that bill. We do not have time for my opinion on someone connected to the Mowbray family pushing a ban on under 16s being on social media, given the amount of tat they advertise at my child via YouTube. But, that's a side point. I just wanted to jump in on the political will point, because I think that's so important, and bringing a bit more context even back pre-2020, because I was working in Parliament in the term before that, and as a press secretary I was just keeping an eye. It was the good old days when Twitter wasn't as bad, still bad, but you could have your tweet deck set up with all your little columns tracking different hashtags and names and stuff. And because I'm a masochist, a couple of the columns I had set up were tracking mentions of Jan Logie, who I worked for, and Golriz Garaman. And boy, that was some not safe for work content to be absorbing in my daily job, because the level of hatred, the language was very much the same. They hadn't quite crystallized around the current neo-Nazi tropes, but they were still using the same kind of language, the same kind of framing, and it just was not taken particularly seriously. And I feel that the slightly awful comparison I want to make is how every time there's a mass shooting in the United States, it turns out that the shooter also had a history of domestic violence or cruelty to animals. Because what do you know? These things all start somewhere. No one goes 0 to erecting a gallows on the grounds of Parliament. There's an escalation, and because we, as a society, the royal we, don't take those first steps of the escalator seriously, they become normalized. And I think that's what I've seen from just that 2017 to 2020 troll bullshit, to COVID lockdown stuff, to now we have the Deputy Prime Minister using QAnon dog whistles to drive a hate mob against a sitting MP. it's kind of that, well, where were we meant to step in? And frankly, I would have said you step in when there is a group of people normalizing, comparing a refugee woman who is now an MP to Goebbels on a daily basis. That's where you step in, because then they don't end up thinking, well, that's okay. Twitter's not banning me for that. Facebook's not banning me for that. No one's stepping in. So actually, maybe going a step further, a step further, a step further is how you get into this situation. At the same time, you've got a parallel with how these social media platforms like Facebook and YouTube have grown. They've grown by allowing this kind of hateful crap and sticking Google AdSense on it. They've done it by not moderating, and now they're at a scale, and the problem is so big that real moderation is impossible functionally, because how many people would you have to hire, and then how many clinical supervisors would you have to hire above them to make sure they're not breaking down from the amount of trauma you're exposing them to, in order to actually get this content off the platforms? So it's become this somewhat impossible problem, but where it started, plenty of people could have pointed at and said, that's what we need to stop happening, because it's going to get worse.
I agree. And I think it's really important point that you picked up there around normalization, because anyone who works in the space of gender-based violence knows that that is actually one of the steps into, having gender-based violence be prevalent, right? It becomes prevalent because it's normal. It becomes normal to call a woman a cunt online. And you might think, well, calling Nicola Willis or whatever a cunt because she is whatever, that doesn't mean anything. But it does, because you have this growing acceptance of treating certain people like they are not human, right? It's the dehumanization. And that continues to the point, as you suggest, that people who you would think would be above that kind of behavior, using it as a tool to target, let's say, political opponents in a campaign. And it's actually, as a side, this isn't quite on point, but when I first started this research, someone asked me, why are you looking at Western democracies for comparison? And I would say, well, in many other countries, the kind of violence that you're talking about this character is very different, because women are generally targeted with actual violence when they try to become a candidate. And it's usually from both the public and their political opponents, who venomously target them in a way that we haven't really seen in Western democracies. I wouldn't necessarily say that anymore. And I think that if you see the writing on the wall, this is where gradually we're going to go if we don't do anything.
Yeah, a friend of mine, friend of the pod, Louise Hutt, who has sadly not been re-elected to Hamilton City Council. Absolute tragedy. Hamilton, what the hell are you doing? But they posted an amazing video of a candidate meeting at which they pointed out that there was a man sitting in one of the front rows of the meeting who had sent them death threats, who had said that they, I believe the phrase was, deserve to have the shit beaten out of them. And this guy showed up at a meeting. Like, that is right there, an individual case of that escalation of some twat sending an abusive email to, well, now he's in the room. What does he do next? How do we exit the building? We had it, I think, with, was it the occupation at Parliament, where video came out that was clearly filmed from Bowen House, which at the time was under earthquake strengthening. So that was just somebody who was in a building that has a direct corridor through to the Beehive, was filming the occupation. And I think they may have said something targeting Golriz again. I mean, obviously, Golriz was targeted for a huge amount. I mean, notably being a strong woman of colour with opinions, God forbid. That escalation is clearly just happening there. And it's resulted, I think we can see in the local government elections, though final results are barely the ink is dry. But I'm sure if someone did the analysis, we would find that local government is now whiter and more male and more heterosexual than it has been in previous terms, because we know people just aren't running because they don't know where that escalation has got to or when the next step is going to be taken. And as you say, we've got a government who ain't going to do shit about that, because what about the free speech of the person who wants to beat the crap out of someone whose opinions they don't like? I mean, maybe if we told them that left-wing university lecturers were posing a threat to politicians, then the Free Speech Union might give a fuck about it. But you know, they have their agenda and they have their terrible branding, and it makes me very mad.
Yeah, and on that point of freedom of expression, this is why I get quite riled up around it, because, you know, that's why we have completely almost unregulated online spaces in terms of discourse. It's this idea that everyone has the freedom of expression if you do any kind of regulation, or if you restrict speech in any way, even if it is to protect somebody else, that is unjustified. And I think that it gives the impression that we live in some utopia of freedom of expression, but we don't. It's the unregulated online spaces that create a situation where people aren't free to express themselves. Women are not free to express themselves. They cannot, they obviously do not feel safe enough to, one, voice their opinions on certain hot button topics. We're seeing that internationally. So it's some great research coming out of the UK. And of course, the UK are ahead on us in this, because they've been doing a lot of research around abuse of MPs since Joe Cox was assassinated in 2016. And so that's why they're kind of ahead. And out of there, we see that there are certain topics that will trigger online violence, particularly for women, for refugee women, for people of colour, for LGBTQIA+. And those issues tend to be gender, LGBTQIA+ rights, particularly around trans issues. Remember, this is the UK. Immigration, climate change. And so these are the really big policy things that we want to be talking about in public discourse, and, you know, have quite robust discussion about, in order to, you know, solve the big problems that we're facing today. But we have politicians who are too scared to sort of talk about that publicly, because they know they're going to be targeted with online violence. And I think that that is a breach of their freedom of expression, and it hinges on that. And to say that unregulated spaces are, oh, we're free to say whatever we want, that's only true if you are not on the receiving end of that online violence, meaning that if you are not a woman, if you are not Māori, if you are not rainbow, yeah, you probably could say whatever you want online. And freedom of expression can be a restricted right, and it's justifiably restricted if it interferes with the rights of others. And those rights, as we know, are non-discrimination, right to participate in public life, and freedom of expression of others. So yeah, I get kind of annoyed about that too.
Yeah, I think there's this pretty clear line developing as well, right? Where it's not just about freedom of expression for people in online spaces. It's actually almost impossible to exist in those spaces. As a woman, as a member of the rainbow community, as an immigrant, it is in some cases just no longer safe. And you get this kind of pushback from what we say far right free speech absolutist groups saying, "Oh, just log off." And you're like, that doesn't work anymore. And also, all of these same groups are continually making the argument, "Oh, these places are like the town square, and that's why we need freedom of expression to share hate and violence in the first place." You can't have that both ways.
I think it's also important to note that even though we are talking about these sites as largely unmoderated and social media as largely unmoderated, it's actually not, because for many, many years, you haven't been able to post the phrase "men are trash" on Facebook. You haven't been able to call out a lot of hate speech and violence because you get dogpiled and reported. Absolute icon of YouTube, Jessie Gender, got suspended from Blue Sky recently for saying the phrase "I wish ill on J.K. Rowling." That was threats and violence. But everyone who's in Jessie's mentions misgendering her, everyone who's in Jessie's mentions making very thinly coded threats of actual violence, oh no, that's fine. That's fine, actually. The lack of moderation only goes in one direction, and it's the direction that supports status quo, white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist values, because that's the stuff they've figured out how to monetize. It doesn't necessarily mean that Facebook are fascist, though Mark Zuckerberg probably is. It just means that that's what they've pinned the absolute charade that is online advertising dollars to, and they don't know how to get out of it, even if they wanted to, which I don't believe they do. So it's this thing. It's why I rail about the Free Speech Union so much, is they have this high and mighty, we love liberty and freedom, but actually that's not true if you're a lecturer who wants to put up a trans flag. That's not true if you're a woman who wants to point out that you are being threatened with sexual violence just for saying that poverty shouldn't exist, or whatever. We've got this absolute charade happening in Parliament where a Green activist did something stupid online vis-a-vis posting Winston Peters' address, and suddenly, all of the politicians who spent years telling us that actually when David Seymour talked about blowing up the Ministry of Pacific Peoples, he was just joking, and actually when Shane Jones and Winston Peters are constantly homophobic to Green MPs, that was just the heat of the moment, they couldn't help themselves. But suddenly Chloe Swarbrick is deliberately fostering the doxing of Winston Peters, according to Nicola Willis. Like, the absolute imbalance of reality when it comes to whose speech actually does get moderated absolutely blows my mind, not in the good way.
Yeah, it's this question of where does power and resources is as well, right? So you can say whatever you want online, and then we're going to send people after you because we can pay them to do that, right? Like we control the systems in which you are speaking. We can make laws against you specifically. We have little groups of hateful activists who are more than happy to beat each other into a frenzy over this stuff. That is not an environment where freedom of speech is possible.
And I think that also raises another point, which is sometimes we can talk about these things in a slightly naturalistic way, where like the hatred and the violence has escalated. It has, but that's also been driven in many ways deliberately. Like there's a reason that talking about trans rights online gets a huge mob in your mentions screaming about you being a child predator, but like Eric Crampton posting about tax policy does not get the same kind of result. And it's because there's not a billionaire funding a left-wing mob to go after Eric Crampton every time he talks about tax. Like there are drivers to this. And at some point, I do think it becomes like a self-fulfilling, normalized thing that this is how people are getting their jollies and the end of late-stage capitalism. But there are also forces who benefit from this hatred escalating, which is another reason why action doesn't get taken on it.
I mean, something that's been very well documented feminist literature is how, whenever you have regulations or terms of service or any kind of systematic kind of tool that is meant to protect people, the people who utilize that are most likely people who are in the dominant social group. So men in particular. So when you're talking about how, you're mass flagged because you talked about, was it J.K. Rowling? That's very well documented. That's quite normal now. It's like whenever you have a tool in place, the dominant people are going to use it because they're the ones who, as you say, have the resources. And that's the same with online moderation. And I will say that there has been research around moderation, particularly on Instagram, and how AI tools are programmed, and particularly AI moderation, content moderation, which is, I think, net good in the terms of like it removes people from being exposed to really harmful shit, where you have an AI tool flag something to be taken down or whatever. But what we are seeing is, as you say, which is reflected in the research, is that it's tweaked in a way where you get, for example, on Instagram, black bodies being not only flagged as inappropriate in comparison to white bodies, but also not deplatformed, but downvoted, so they don't come up in people's feeds as much. And so what you end up with is not only are they being removed from the platform, but if they are on the platform, you can't find it. So your feed ends up replicating a particular type of body, as we know, we all use Instagram. And that's all driven by how an AI tool is being used. So when I say unregulated, I mean it's not regulated for safety. It's regulated for advertisers, because that is the economic model that they're working on. And yeah, so just it basically everything that you said, yes, I just wanted to make sure that research supports that.
Look, I do the ranting and you bring the empirical evidence. It's a perfect balance. And Kyle is here for gender parity.
That's exactly the only reason I'm still on this call. Also, I have control over the Zoom, so this recording just doesn't happen without me here. Sadly. But I
All
hope
the
I'm
men
using
with the resources,
exactly.
Typical, holding on to the levers of power.
All I can hope is that I'm slowly trying to pull some of that back. Let's zoom in or zoom out a little bit if we can, because I want to talk about these ideas around online abuse versus online violence, because I think these words can be used interchangeably a lot, and often end up conflating issues and not being helpful for us discussing regulation. For example, we had a interesting turn of phrase today, I believe it was, from Andrew Little talking about toxicity towards Tory Whānau when she was the mayor, which seems like one of these sorts of conflations, or which intentionally or not really downplays what happened during her tenure as mayor, with the violent targeting of her, sometimes by people she was working with, by the media, and ended with her deciding not to run for mayor again. There's a direct political implication of this, and I know myself and perhaps some other people felt like it didn't really. It's pretty easy for the new mayor to just say something out of hand like this, right? Like, good. Yeah, you should say something like that. That's great, but it almost belittled the experience.
Yeah, and I think to be fair, I think he was responding particularly to Tori's comments in the media. I think she used the word toxic as well. She called it a toxic environment. But that's as fair as I'm going to be, because I, on the one hand, and I've said this on Blue Sky before, on the one hand, I think it is good to have men in politics, particularly someone like Andrew Little who's been in politics for a long time, to actually come out and say this is happening, and it is. I don't actually know if he said it was gendered and racist, so he didn't go that far, but that's what it was, and to say this isn't okay and this needs to change. But at the same time, again, he didn't go far enough, I think, and I think it was probably because he knew he was going to be asked about it. But also he never said what he was going to do to change it.
As the mayor now, right?
As the mayor, like, come in with, you've been looking at this whole campaign, and it's come up again and again, not just with Tory, but with other councillors as well, Louise Hutt, as we've already talked about, but Terry O'Neill, and others who have been very blunt with the kind of abuse that they've seen, and that they've received in their tenure, and particularly in the campaign. And he's watched all of that, and right at the end says, "Oh, it's toxic. It's not okay." And
And he's
doesn't have
benefited
a
from
plan.
it
He
as
had
well.
time to make a plan, to be like, well, I'm definitely going to be mayor. What am I going to do? This seems to be a hot button issue. It's in the media almost every day, for months. What am I going to do? And he doesn't actually give us anything other than, oh, that's bad, and we should call it out. That's not okay.
It's not even just
Which is
that.
more than what some men in politics are doing. So I do
low
give
bar.
him that. A
Yeah,
very low bar. He's crossed that. So
he spent the entire campaign like, I'm going to be mayor, right? Like, as you say. But even further than that, I'm going to be mayor because I've benefited from from the like campaigns against Tory Whānau. he
Yeah,
is.
so he's directly, yeah, and that was, yeah, the other point. Thanks for bringing it up. Yeah, absolutely. He directly benefits from all of that toxicity that was directed towards her, but doesn't acknowledge that either.
Yeah.
And actually acts like this was her choice. This was never her choice.
No.
She didn't step out of the race because she this was the time for me to leave the being mayor. She had more in her because she felt like she had no choice, especially when he stepped in to be our hero and save Wellington. um,
With that kind of context in the New Zealand local politics, what do you see as the difference between something like, toxic behavior, online abuse, and online violence? Because I think you tend to use the term online violence much more specifically and more frequently when you're talking about this kind of stuff.
yeah, so I use online violence in order to differentiate it from general, what people might see as offensive or abusive in sort of a wider way. So online violence to me is very specific. It is, targeted harassment. It is image-based sexual abuse, so like revenge porn or AI deepfakes, for example. It is targeted disinformation campaigns, something that leads to someone feeling unsafe. So the point of it is to humiliate, intimidate, silence, and frighten. And that's what I would classify as online violence. And not all online behavior is going to fulfill those kind of categories. It could just be kind of mean and kind of like, ugh, that's kind of gross. But it doesn't make you fear for your safety, like online violence can.
Do you draw a line between that and something like stochastic terrorism? Or do you see them as pretty intertwined?
Can you explain what you mean by sarcastic terrorism?
So stochastic terrorism, people in power amplifying those kind of targeted campaigns and targeted disinformation, for example, to create real life violence that puts people in harm's way.
Right. Yeah. So it's not necessarily online violence in and of itself, but what it does is weaponize a movement to cause online violence against somebody. So you're weaponizing social media essentially. And I mean, we've always had disinformation and political campaigning and in politics, we've always had smear campaigns, but we've now entered a era where it is sort of supercharged by social media. So it feels to the target much more intense, and it's ubiquitous. It's all with you all the time, and it spreads fast. It's at scale that we've probably never seen before. And yes, certain people can utilize that to their benefit, but in and of itself, it's not violence, but it is a tool to cause online violence or to perpetuate a environment where someone can feel unsafe.
Yeah, thank you. I guess that's like a good example of that would be what happened to Benjamin Doyle, right? So I guess anyone who listens to the podcast, we've talked about this on current events a few times now, but essentially it started out as a targeted disinformation and smear campaign against a sitting New Zealand MP that was then propagated on social media among, I guess, who you'd like broadly call political networks in that space, what you might call political outriders, even, so more closely connected to or associated with political parties, and culminated initially in the then Deputy Prime Minister, Winston Peters, amplifying that. And the media duly just reported what he was saying instead of going, wait a second, what part are we playing in this? Amplifying that disinformation further. And we've talked about it earlier on the podcast as well, we've alluded to it, that ended with Benjamin Doyle resigning from Parliament for fear of harm to themselves and their family. And we know now as well that at least one person's actually been arrested and charged, and there are ongoing police investigations for I think at least 4 more.
And can we just highlight, like, given the state of the law and given the culture of the New Zealand police, like, the fact that someone's been arrested and charged tells you how fucking bad it was. Like,
That's what I was about to say. It must be very egregious in order for it
Yeah.
to secure charges under the HDCA. That's the Harmful Digital Communications Act. Yeah, that's a high bar, particularly against a political figure.
Are you seeing anything like this elsewhere in the West? Is this part of that same pattern you're talking about, seeing in Western democracies? Because it certainly felt like something quite new here and quite sharp in regards to, meeting that bar for the police to first investigate and then take action.
Yep, for sure. So particularly in the US, very much utilized there, but perhaps we don't call that a Western democracy anymore. But certainly at the time of the 2020, oh, what was it? When was the election there? 2024? Do you
Oh,
remember?
you mean the one where Trump was recently
Yeah,
elected? Yeah.
yeah, 24. Very much used against Kamala, but also against AOC as well. Very much networked misogyny used against them, which means that once again you've got key political figures or key public figures utilizing or weaponizing social media in a way that targets them specifically, and disinformation was used against both of them. So with Kamala, it was that she slept her way to the top, and that there was a lot of sexualized rumors about her that spread online. And similar with AOC, I think she actually had huge numbers of sexualized deepfakes circulating about her. And certainly in the UK, we're also seeing that play out. It has been recently called out in an inquiry. So at the moment, the British government are doing an inquiry specifically on online abuse of women MPs. And one of the things to come out of that was calling out other politicians for utilizing that behavior to target their opponents. And that's not just on the right, it is also on the left. And the UK is interesting in that way because it's we might say, oh, it's the right wing using it, but actually it's across the spectrum.
When you say left in the UK, you're talking about Labour?
Yeah. So maybe that's not quite accurate, but in terms
left asterisk.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but what I'm saying there is that it's
Across
across
both major
the
parties.
political spectrum.
Yeah.
How short that spectrum is, certainly. So yes, it is happening. And I bring up the stuff about deepfakes because that exploded in the US election and has become an increasing problem in the UK. There is a Scottish MP, I forget her name, very bad with names, sorry, I have autism. One of my problems is remembering names, including my own family members. And so in the UK, there's a Scottish MP who was targeted with sexualized deepfakes, and she's come out online and talked about, she's used it in order to help pass a law to criminalize that behavior in Scotland. And that's actually one of the things that I would watch out for the next election coming up for us, because what we tend to see in the UK especially ends up happening here. So when that happened to Benjamin Doyle, it did not surprise me. Particularly the use of the homophobic tropes around linking pedophilia with LGBT communities, which was very clear. I mean, even my own mother said to me, oh, did you know that Benjamin Doyle is a pedophile? My mother is not online. She's never online. So she got that purely from what's been talked about on the nightly news. And she believes, God bless her, she believes Winston Peters. So she also came out with that. So yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that other than that didn't surprise me at all. And because people hate pedophiles and child abusers, it brought out much more violent rhetoric that we probably hadn't seen in quite some time since probably Garraman. Yeah.
And I think, dragging us back to one of the core pillars of 1 of 200, which is ragging on the media, the use of those deepfakes and that disinformation, one of the things I find so frustrating about it is that highlights the need for strong, independent, authoritative media who don't pull these bullshit games. Because what we're starting to see in terms of AI generated news videos and fake
Hmm.
headlines and fake outlets, we actually need a stuff.co.nz and nzherald.co.nz, God bless them, and rnz.co.nz that actually is trustworthy, so that we have sources independent of government and independent of business and independent of lobby groups that can say, here's what was actually said, here's where the person actually was, here's the actual facts of the case. And if they're not going to do that because they're also chasing an infinitely decreasing ad revenue, then we can't complain if people start trusting authoritative looking screenshots of news stories that don't exist and aren't real. And it just, like, when journos get pissy about critics online, I'm like, guys, we want you to be better because we need you to be better, because democracies can't function without
Yeah.
you. So stop doing this bullshit.
Yeah, I'm counting down at the moment to a both sides with a deep faked situation, or like a well, but who can really say? There's this real underlying almost nihilism across media and politics at the moment, which is like, oh, reality doesn't really exist anymore because of Trump, and so we've given up, and this is someone else's reality. I can't remember exactly where I heard this said, but I have seen this said like by a reporter, not in a New Zealand context, where like, oh, but people have different realities. It's like, no, I think it might have been around RFK Jr. stuff, right? So you have to report on both sides of this, and like, but one actually doesn't exist. One actually, you can talk about like what their social context is or like how they feel about this stuff, but you can't both sides their contention around physical reality. But I feel like, yeah, we're getting close to the point where what was the one that happened recently? The ICE agents being attacked in the US, but it was a deep fake, and several news outlets put it out, right? But that's exactly the kind of thing that could be used to create political violence and online violence, and then get reported as who can say which was real.
And I think tying it all back to some of the other things we've been talking about, and bringing up what happened with Tory, the fact that the Post ran like a front page story alleging there was a salacious video of her that it turned out didn't exist.
That's what I'm
No one
talking
had
about,
seen it.
right?
The journalist had not even seen it. And what annoys me, particularly with that, and also with what happened to Benjamin and any other number of cases, is that we don't just need media to be independent and authoritative. We need you guys to understand what the fuck is going on in the world, because it should be sending up so many red flags. Oh, the Maori woman mayor who people have been attacking for her social life. Suddenly you're getting a really sexualized rumor about her. You definitely want to get more than one source on that. You definitely want to check that. Oh, the first non-binary MP in New Zealand's history, and suddenly there's allegations about the safety of children. That doesn't just hit you as being an obvious dog whistle meme. You've got to have that context in your heads instead of just being like, well, the Deputy Prime Minister said it, so I guess it's
Yeah.
true. Or, well, we've run multiple stories about Tory drinking in public, God forbid, so this might as well be one of them too. Just like when Aaron Sorkin is writing shows that demonstrate better news ethics than you, God love me, I watched that show and parts of it were actually funny. But you've got to have that context, and you've got to put things into that context, because that is how people can be actually informed, not just presented with a list of quotes and then, well, we don't want to judge, we're going to leave it up to the readers to decide, which is just an abrogation of journalistic ethics. Sorry, team.
Yeah, I think this is exactly what the state of play that I'm talking about when I say some reporters are absolutely ready to see a fake video about the stuff, right? Or fake images created and go like, oh, but I've seen the evidence, and just run it because they're already running it without the evidence. They're already running the story without the evidence. Very frustrating to watch, but also incredibly damaging to the people impacted who really have no recourse except to remove themselves from public life, as we've talked about in each of these cases. Cassandra, what is being talked about as, I don't know if solutions is the right term, because this doesn't seem like something we can just go, oh, we can fix this. But what movement is there in that direction in terms of, okay, we've identified what a lot of the issues are, right? We know regulation would be pretty helpful. But how do we get to a place where we actually do take a step back? I guess I hate to do it, but it has had news coverage. There's this Taxpayers Union Courier poll that came out today with the Taxpayers Union now taking a line around political violence. You've noted on Blue Sky today that it's the way in which we've treated free speech absolutism that has got us here to some extent. What the poll said was that 1 in 7 Kiwis believe violence may be needed to get the country back on track. Now, I'm not convinced by the way that Curia polls generally, and I don't think this was necessarily useful, but I think it's still indicative of a direction. What was your kind of response to that? And yeah, how do we step back from that direction and step back from the edge on some of that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to reiterate, yeah, it is because we have free speech absolutionism. And it's funny because it's coming from a group that is very strongly for freedom of speech, actually. I'll say they don't use freedom of expression, they use free speech because it all comes from a US centric libertarianism any view. And because I haven't looked at the poll in a mass amount of detail, like what is the 1 in 7, I don't know. And I'm not sure whether it's statistically significant enough to have, like, this is definitely what a certain number of Kiwis want or think is useful. For the future of the country, or whether it is a serious question in their mind. But I will say that we are already in a situation where we have a lot of political violence. It just happens online, and we don't treat it like violence. And I mean, yeah, that's where I'd come down on it in the end. That it is already happening. Just because you don't see burning cars doesn't mean it's not burning someone's life down around them. And we've already seen 2 examples of that, actually 3 examples of that. Colesgolarez is another example. We know from court records that at least part of her PTSD is due to the online violence that she was subjected to since she was elected. And we've seen increasing research around young people, because I think there was also and you can remind me, Kyle, there was a piece of data around youth. It was higher among youth.
Yeah, it was higher
Yeah, it was.
among 18 to 39-year-olds. So a pretty broad spectrum. It was up in at
Oh, yeah.
21%.
Okay.
So about a
Oh,
fifth.
okay. No, I think that's significant. And that makes sense to me because that aligns with a lot of research around young people, particularly if we split by gender, how young women are much more sort of progressive, and then we've got young men coming out and much more radicalized in terms of misogyny. So it kind of makes sense there. Um, and I think that that's interesting. But I mean, in the end, I'd come down to we're already seeing an increase in violence. It's just online. And if we don't start taking that seriously, you will see offline violence increase because we've already seen some examples of that.
I also just want to flag that poll and the fact that this got into the headline, like, again, journos, come on, red flags. The fact that the question is specifically about getting the country back on track, which is like
Yeah.
1.5 steps away from make New Zealand great again. Like, there's a dog
This
whistle
is the
in the
thing, right?
poll question.
Yeah.
So A, it's a useless poll question, but B, don't put that in the freaking headline. Don't buy into the idea that the country is off track in some way without interrogating it further.
Yeah. This is a contradiction in a lot of stuff that groups like the Taxpayers Union do, right? So Taxpayers Union was coming out about this and saying, "Oh, this is a really bad direction," yada yada yada. You commissioned this poll and set the headline up. Like, what are you really trying to do with this? I guess there's also a question around like, what does it mean to believe that violence is going to happen, right? And something we've contended in the past is around, if we're doing a structural analysis and saying violence is going to happen at some point if the economic situation continues to be this bad, people are disenfranchised, have no money, can't support their families, there will be more political violence because that's what happens in human history. And then people saying, "Oh, you're calling for a civil war," right? So there are a lot of reasons why people could have answered this question in different ways. But as you say, the political violence is already here. We're just not
We don't recognize it.
categorizing it.
Yeah, that's right. And that's really frustrating for someone who researches this stuff because it's not only is it happening now, it's increasing. We're seeing the trends overseas of this, and it will come to the fore eventually. And I don't want it to. Maybe it just kind of lingers and sizzles away, and it doesn't get any worse. But what is worse? Well, worse is offline violence, because I don't think it can get any worse online. You already have MPs and candidates stepping down or not stepping up, less political ambition among certain vulnerable groups due to this. So it's already working, is
Yeah,
what I'm saying. There's a
yeah.
long way of getting there. It's already working. It's
And
already having an effect. It's already doing what it wants to do. It meaning people who use online violence as a tool to silence, or humiliate, and coerce.
with the changes you said had been happening in the UK since
Mm.
2023, has there been much research into whether that is being effective, or if that is a direction that we can take, and we can follow suit on, or is there a separate set of things which we'd really need to do here in Aotearoa?
So first thing, so as you've flagged really early, is that this is a really huge problem, and one that we're probably 20 plus years into. So, in terms of one piece of legislation, the Online Safety Act in the UK, that's not going to solve everything. And the UK government is pretty open about that.
Yeah.
And it's going to take a really long time to get to a point where it's actually being implemented fully. So what's happening now since 2023 is Ofcom, which is the media regulator, is very slowly going through and creating or helping industry create codes of conduct for each industry, around each of their duties under the Act. And so at the moment, they've just completed their child sexual exploitation and kind of pornographic material codes of conduct, and what they should be doing to meet their minimum safety obligations under the Act. And they're moving through the different categories now. So you won't see the impact of that for some time, but that work needs to happen, and it needs to happen very carefully. I know that they're looking specifically, just bringing it back to a feminism, to online gender-based violence against women and girls. So they're looking specifically at that, which I think is really great. And so they're doing it one by one. The other difference between here and there is that the UK have a slate. When they brought in the Act, they had a slate of criminalised behaviour online. So making image-based sexual abuse specifically a crime. And they did this so under the Act they could say to the social media platforms and services, other services, you should assess your services. So you're looking for risks of illegal content or
Hmm.
illegal behavior. So it's much easier to attach it to something that is illegal. And that helps if you want to argue that restrictions to freedom of expression should be justified. Well, it's justified here because these things are specifically illegal.
Yeah.
What's also happening in the UK is that we have some litigation going on, lingering through Meta and X Corp, particularly in relation to some of those obligations. So they're saying we don't have to do this. That goes too far. So that's all working itself out. Again, it's a really long process. And in Australia, they've had an e-safety commissioner for years, which, you might say, oh, isn't that like NetSafe here? No. So e-safety has statutory powers to request and now enforce content takedown on those social media platforms. So if they have something that breaches their law or their obligations, that the e-safety commissioner can say to X or say to Meta, you need to take that down and you need to take it down now, which NetSafe can't do here. So we don't have that architecture in place to, if something like that happens to you here. Sorry, I'm jumping around a lot. It's my ADHD.
Welcome to one of 200.
Right. What
Everyone's used
excellent
to it.
listening.
Yeah, yeah. Everyone's like, yeah, this is exactly what I signed up for.
Okay, great. So let's say you have a deepfake sexualized images of you online. Let's say it's on Instagram and you're trying to get it taken down. It's not being taken down. You've tried reporting it, whatever, it's not happening. You go to NetSafe. NetSafe asks Meta very nicely to take it down. And then it's really up to Meta whether they do that or not. If they
Right.
don't, very little a person can do here. You could perhaps go to the district court after that process in order to get a court order. The court can't necessarily order Meta to take it down, or it could ask very nicely once again, but it can get the person who published it to take it down. If you can find out who that is. If they use a VPN, you can't find out who
Yeah.
that is. And that's where we're at. So yes, I do think that we can do the same thing here, and I think that it should be minimum safety standards and obligations that are not less than other countries in order to have consistency. But I also think that this is a very long process that we need to pick up from where we left off with the internal affairs online safety platforms, whatever it's called, review that they did, and restart that process. Because I think in New Zealand we have a unique situation. We have the te tiriti, and so what an online safety or what a safe digital environment looks like here, we haven't had that conversation nationally. Like, what would that look like for us? Instead of online safety, you might be thinking about or talking about manaakitanga, for example. So we need to think about that, and then how do we achieve that? And I'm a lawyer, so using law and regulation. And we absolutely can do that. And I would go further and argue that the government has to do that under international human rights law. It is in breach if it does not. This is foreseeable harm, not only foreseeable, happening now and happening at scale.
Is
There
it
you go.
then like particularly a political leadership issue? You know, we talked about political will a few times over the course of this episode. You mentioned that one of the first things out the window from Brooke Van Velden was changes based on the review. Do we just need someone in government who's like, we're actually just doing this now and it's just going to happen? Like, is that what it's going to take?
I think it will take political will to restart the conversation that we were already having.
Mhm.
We had some really great submissions in that review process from all sorts of different organizations and individuals, which had some really good thoughts on where to take these proposals. And yes, you need a government who is willing to have that conversation, and we don't have that. There's no way you can with an ACT party coalition. And I'm not saying that because, oh, I hate ACT. No, because of ACT's policies around freedom of expression.
Yeah, and the actions we've already seen them take, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So you would be looking for an incoming change of government before anything will take off.
Yeah, I just wanted to tackle that and say maybe a bit more strongly, because I'm not an academic or a lawyer, that part of the problem with the current government is that we have two parties in the coalition who, frankly, build their political strategy around online abuse and dog whistles and conspiracy weirdness. And of course, they're not going to do anything that genuinely threatens that. And National won't do anything because they need those guys. So there we go. Change the government, folks.
Wonderful. What a fantastic call to end this on. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Cassandra Mudgway.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Where can people find you online?
So you can find me on Blue Sky and Instagram at Legally Feminist.
Wonderful. And thank you to my co-host, Stephanie, joining us once again.
Thank you so much for having me, Kyle, and thank you for making Cassandra talk first, because my actual nightmare going into this was that you were going to throw to me first, then I was going to say something, and Cassandra was going to have to jump in with, okay, so what Stephanie's got wrong is. So, cheers.
And you got nothing wrong, so.
And where can people find you, Stephanie?
I am on most platforms as at Boots Theory, and if you get the reference, you get a cookie, only an online cookie, but not the kind that's going to steal your data. Boom!
Wonderful. And if you've enjoyed this, if you think we're having good conversations that should be more widely accessed, I like to think we're discussing things in depth, conversationally, that you're not going to hear in too many other places. Give us a share, give us a like, send it to a friend, send it to your parents, your grandparents. I don't mind. We like everyone in our audience here. Really appreciate everyone who is helping us to get people's voices out to the wider electorate in Aotearoa. That's been another episode of 1 of 200. We'll catch you next week.
If artificers are denied, living a pointless life, but learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The road's apart now. It's paved with good intentions, and I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when they quote this as a cost we ought to stay. 'Cause I live amongst the people every day.